I never imagined that belonging could be voted away, that love, years of sacrifice and blood ties could be reduced to a show of hands in a room that still smelled like burnt coffee and lemon disinfectant. That morning, I walked into the community hall with my shoulders squared, telling myself this was just another misunderstanding, another family disagreement that could be talked through if everyone stayed calm. I was wrong. I was painfully, publicly wrong. The hall had those long folding tables lined up in a square, the kind used for potlucks and bingo nights. I'd sat at them for years, helping organize fundraisers, baby showers, memorial lunches. I had cooked in that kitchen, scrubbed those floors, folded those chairs at the end of countless evenings. This place had known my laughter and my grief, and now it was full of faces that refused to meet my eyes. My son, Daniel, sat 2 chairs away from me. He was 23, still with that soft look about him that told the world he believed people were mostly good. His knee bounced under the table, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. Every few seconds he glanced at me, then at his father, then down at his hands like he was trying to hold himself together by force alone. Across from us sat my ex-husband's family, along with a few elders from the community council. Technically, this meeting wasn't supposed to be about me. Officially, it was about restoring harmony and addressing concerns. But the real agenda sat heavy in the air, unspoken yet obvious. They wanted me gone. It had started quietly months earlier, little exclusions that felt accidental at first, not being told about gatherings, decisions made without my input, whispers that stopped when I walked into a room. I told myself not to be paranoid. I told myself grief made people sensitive. Losing my husband after 27 years had already stripped me raw. I didn't want to believe the people I'd called family were turning away from me too. Then came the letter requesting my presence at the council meeting. No explanation, just a date, a time, and that cold phrase, attendance required. Daniel had read it over my shoulder, his brow furrowing. "Mom, this doesn't feel right," he'd said. I told him it would be fine. I needed to believe that. The chairperson cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. His voice echoed slightly in the hall, too loud in the tense quiet. He spoke about traditions, about rules that were older than all of us. He talked about complaints, about discomfort, about the need to protect the community's reputation. Every word felt like it was circling me without saying my name. Finally, someone did say it. My sister-in-law, Ruth, leaned forward, her lips pressed into a thin line. She said my presence had become disruptive, that my grief was unsettling, that my refusal to quietly step aside after my husband's death showed a lack of respect. I remember the room tilting slightly, like I was on a boat that had suddenly lost balance. I opened my mouth to speak, but Daniel beat me to it. He stood so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. His crack cracked as he said, "This is my mother. She's done nothing wrong. You can't just decide she doesn't belong." Someone told him to sit down. Someone else said this was adult business. I reached for his hand, trying to calm him, but my fingers were trembling. I wanted to speak for myself, to tell them about the nights I stayed with their children, the money I donated quietly, the years I stood beside my husband, building everything they now wanted to protect from me. But every time I tried, I was interrupted. Then the chairperson said the words that still echo in my ears, "We will now take a vote." I didn't fully understand what that meant until he explained. A vote to formally ban me from participating in community events, from attending meetings, from using shared spaces. A vote to mark me as unwelcome. A vote to exile me without ever using that word. Daniel shook his head, tears spilling down his face. "Please," he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper, "please don't do this. She's all I have left." I will never forget how small he looked in that moment, standing alone while the people who had watched him grow up stared past him. The chairperson asked those in favor to raise their hands. One by one, they did. Ruth raised hers without hesitation, so did my former brother-in-law, then others, people who had hugged me at my husband's funeral, people who had eaten at my table. Hands kept going up, slow and deliberate, until the majority was undeniable. I felt something inside me go quiet, not explode, not shatter, just go still, like a door closing softly but permanently. Daniel sobbed openly now, his shoulders shaking. I pulled him into me, holding his head against my chest as if I could shield him from the sight of those raised hands. The vote passed. No one looked relieved, no one looked triumphant. They just looked finished, like they'd completed an unpleasant chore. The chairperson said the decision would be put into writing. He thanked everyone for their participation, and just like that, it was over. We walked out together, Daniel and I, into the harsh brightness of the afternoon sun. He kept apologizing over and over, as if this was somehow his fault. I told him none of this was on him. I told him we would be okay. I needed him to believe that. That night, after Daniel fell asleep on the couch from sheer emotional exhaustion, I sat at my kitchen table and cried until my chest hurt. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, silent tears that soaked into the wood I'd refinished with my husband years ago. I thought about all the ways I'd tried to be good, to be generous, to belong, and I realized something painful and clarifying. I had been playing by rules that were never meant to protect me. What they didn't know was that I had already called a lawyer that afternoon, not out of revenge, but out of survival, because being quiet had cost me enough, and because sometimes the only way to be heard is through ink and law and truth laid bare on paper. They thought the vote was the end of my story. They had no idea it was only the beginning. The lawyer's office smelled like old books and lemon polish, the kind of place that made you sit up straighter without realizing it. I hadn't planned on going there that same day. My hands were still shaking from the meeting, my eyes swollen, my heart heavy with the image of Daniel crying in that hall. But something in me knew that if I went home and tried to sleep on it, I might talk myself out of protecting us. I had done that too many times before. The receptionist gave me a soft smile when I said my name, as if she already knew why I was there. Maybe she did. In small towns, news travels faster than comfort. I sat in the waiting chair, clutching my purse like it was the only solid thing left in my world. I thought about my husband, about how he used to say that rules only mattered if they were fair, and that silence was never neutral. I wished he were there to tell me I was doing the right thing. When the lawyer finally called me in, he didn't rush me. He let me talk. I told him everything, from the raised hands to the way the vote was framed as tradition rather than exclusion. I told him about Daniel's tears, about the years I had given to that community, about the way they used my grief as a reason to erase me. He listened without interrupting, his pen moving steadily across a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back and sighed. "What they did," he said carefully, "may feel personal, but it's also procedural, and procedures can be challenged." That was the first time since the meeting that I felt something like relief. Not victory, not joy, just the sense that I wasn't crazy for feeling wronged. He explained my rights, the bylaws they had cited, the inconsistencies in how those rules had been applied over the years. He told me about the letter he could draft, how it would formally request documentation, justification, and a temporary suspension of the ban until everything was reviewed. I nodded, absorbing his words slowly. "Do it," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I don't want revenge. I just want them to understand they can't do this to people." He gave a small, knowing smile. "Often," he said, "understanding comes after consequences." The letter went out 3 days later. Thick paper, clear language, no insults, no emotional pleas, just facts, timelines, and the unmistakable presence of legal accountability. I didn't tell Daniel about it right away. He needed time to breathe, to remember that his life was bigger than that room and those raised hands. I let him sleep, go to class, sit quietly with his grief without adding more weight to his shoulders. Meanwhile, the silence from the community was loud. No messages, no explanations, just an absence that felt deliberate. I wondered how many of them were replaying that vote in their heads, how many were convincing themselves it had been necessary. I wondered if any of them missed me yet, or if I had already become a cautionary tale whispered about over kitchen tables. The first response came not from the council, but from Ruth. She called me late one evening, her voice tight and polite in that brittle way people use when they're trying to stay in control. She said she had heard about the letter and wanted to clear the air. I told her calmly that there was nothing to clear, that everything she needed to say could be said through proper channels now. There was a long pause before she hung up without saying goodbye. Daniel noticed the shift before I explained it to him. He saw the tension in my shoulders ease just a little, the way I no longer flinched when my phone buzzed. One night, as we were washing dishes together, he asked me softly if I was okay. I took a breath and told him about the lawyer, about the letter, about the fact that sometimes standing up didn't look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looked like paperwork and patience. He stared at the sink for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm glad you did something," he said. "I didn't want that to be how it ended." Neither did I. A week later, the council requested a follow-up meeting. This time, the tone was different, formal, careful. They asked for mediation. They mentioned misunderstandings and emotional responses. I could almost hear the unspoken panic behind their words. The ban had felt safe when it was just a room full of raised hands. It felt much less safe now that it had to be explained on paper. I agreed to the meeting, but on my terms. The lawyer would be present. Daniel would not. He didn't need to carry that weight again. When I walked back into the hall, it looked the same as before, but it felt smaller, less powerful. The tables hadn't moved, but the people around them had. Eyes met mine this time, some with guilt, some with defiance, some with something like fear. They talked a lot about intention, about community values, about how things had escalated. I listened the way I wished they had listened to me weeks earlier. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't recount every hurt. I simply told them that belonging was not a privilege they could revoke when someone became inconvenient, and that grief was not misconduct. He did the rest. He spoke about policy, about precedent, about the legal risks of selective enforcement. He asked for records they couldn't immediately provide. Each question landed like a quiet reminder that their authority was not absolute. When the meeting ended, the ban was suspended pending review. No apology yet, no grand reversal, but it was enough to show Daniel that hands raised in judgment were not the final word, enough to show myself that I had not imagined the injustice. When we got home that night, Daniel hugged me in the doorway and held on longer than usual. "I'm proud of you," he said into my shoulder. I closed my eyes and let myself feel that fully and without reservation. I didn't know how the story would end yet, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was no longer asking for permission to exist in spaces I had helped build, and whether they liked it or not, they were finally listening. The days after the mediation felt strange, like living in the pause between breaths. Nothing was officially resolved, but nothing was the same either. I woke each morning half expecting another letter, another call, another blow disguised as formality. Instead, there was a cautious quiet, the kind that suggests people are choosing their steps carefully. I learned quickly that silence can mean many things. This one meant they were thinking. Daniel tried to return to normal, or at least a version of it. He went to class, met friends, laughed at a show one evening in a way that startled me with its suddenness. I let him have that laughter without asking questions. He deserved moments untouched by what had happened. Still, I noticed how he checked the driveway before pulling in, how he paused when the phone rang, how he seemed older than he had a month ago. Watching your child learn that fairness is fragile changes you. For me, the memories of that vote replayed themselves at odd moments. Folding laundry, standing in line at the grocery store, I would see a raised hand in my mind and feel my chest tighten all over again. The lawyer told me this was normal, that public rejection leaves marks even when it's addressed. I believed him. I just didn't know how long those marks would last. One afternoon, I ran into Mrs. Calder at the pharmacy. She had been one of the people who raised her hand. She stood behind me in line, and I felt her presence before I turned around. When I did, our eyes met, and something in her face crumpled. She opened her mouth, closed it, then finally whispered my name. "I'm sorry," she said, so quietly I almost missed it. It wasn't a grand apology. It didn't undo anything, but it was real. I nodded, unsure what else to offer in that moment. She looked relieved just to be acknowledged. When she left, I realized my hands were shaking, not with anger, but with the strange release that comes when someone admits you were hurt. Not everyone was so reflective. Ruth avoided me entirely. Others offered smiles that felt rehearsed, as if they were practicing what decency looked like now that it was required. I didn't chase their approval. I had learned the cost of that. Instead, I focused on my home, on Daniel, on the quiet routines that reminded me life continued beyond that hall. Then the official letter arrived. The council had completed its preliminary review. The ban, they wrote, was being reconsidered due to procedural irregularities. They invited me to submit a written statement to be included in the final decision. I read the letter twice, then set it down and stared out the window for a long time. Writing that statement was harder than I expected, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew how much power words could carry now. I wanted to be honest without being bitter, firm without being cruel. I wrote about my years of service, about my husband's legacy, about the way grief had been weaponized against me. I wrote about Daniel, though I didn't name him, about the harm done when children watch adults choose exclusion over compassion. When I finished, I felt wrung out but lighter, like I had finally told my side of the story without being interrupted. The lawyer reviewed it, suggested minor edits, then sent it on my behalf. Another quiet act of standing, another brick laid in a foundation I hadn't realized I was building. The waiting stretched on. Weeks passed. Autumn deepened, leaves collecting along the edges of the street. One evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the sky turn that deep blue that always made me reflective. He asked me if I ever wished we could just leave, start over somewhere no one knew our names. I thought about it carefully before answering. Sometimes, I said, but running doesn't heal what was broken, and staying doesn't mean accepting what's wrong. He nodded, leaning his head against my shoulder. In that moment, I understood that this fight was about more than a community vote. It was about modeling self-respect, about showing him that dignity wasn't loud, but it was persistent. The final meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I didn't attend. My lawyer advised me it wasn't necessary, that the decision would be based on the documentation now. I spent that morning cleaning out a closet instead, donating clothes I no longer wore, letting go of things that no longer fit who I was becoming. It felt symbolic, though I hadn't planned it that way. The call came just after noon. The ban was officially overturned. The council acknowledged errors in process and reinstated my full participation rights. The words apology and regret appeared, carefully placed but present. I thanked the lawyer and hung up, sitting down on the edge of the bed as the reality settled. I had won, in the technical sense, but the victory felt quiet, thoughtful, not triumphant. I didn't rush to tell anyone. I waited until Daniel came home, until we could sit together and let it be ours first. When I told him, his face broke into a smile that was half relief, half belief. He hugged me, laughing a little through tears. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the raised hands, about the letter, about the way power shifts when people are forced to see you clearly. I knew not everyone would suddenly welcome me back. Some bridges had burned too hot for that. But I also knew something else, something deeper and steadier. They had tried to ban me as if I were disposable. They had learned instead that I was rooted, and roots, once tested, tend to grow stronger. The first Sunday after the ban was overturned, I stood in front of my closet for a long time, holding a navy blue dress I hadn't worn in over a year. It wasn't fancy, just something I'd worn to countless gatherings and services, something that carried the faint scent of lavender, detergent, and memory. Part of me didn't want to go back at all. Part of me wanted to walk in and sit in the front row just to prove a point. In the end, I chose something simple and comfortable, not defiant, not apologetic, just present. Daniel offered to come with me, but I told him he didn't have to. I wanted him to see that I could do this on my own, and I wanted to see it too. Still, he walked me to the car and hugged me before I left, his arms tight around my shoulders. "Text me if you need me," he said. I promised I would. Driving to the hall felt like revisiting a wound that had finally scabbed over. The building looked the same as always, beige siding, slightly crooked sign out front, a row of cars in the gravel lot. I sat in the car for a minute with the engine off, listening to my own breathing. Then I opened the door and stepped out. Inside, the air was thick with familiar sounds, chairs scraping, low conversations, the hum of the old heater. I walked in slowly, feeling eyes on me. Some people smiled, genuine and warm. Others looked away, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the bulletin board. I didn't let it stop me. I found a seat near the middle and sat down, folding my hands in my lap. Mrs. Calder came over and squeezed my hand. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered. I believed her. Ruth did not approach me. She sat across the room, talking to someone else, her posture stiff. I felt a flicker of sadness for what had been lost between us, but not regret for standing up. Some relationships, I realized, only survive on silence. Once truth enters, they fracture. The meeting proceeded like any other. Announcements, plans for upcoming events, discussions about repairs. No one mentioned the ban. No one acknowledged the elephant that at once sat in the center of that room. I understood why. Public apologies are rare, especially from groups. They are messy, vulnerable things. Still, a small part of me had hoped for more. Afterward, a few people approached me with quiet words. "We missed you. I'm sorry for how things went. It shouldn't have happened." Each comment felt like a small stitch closing a tear, not enough to erase the scar, but enough to prevent it from reopening. On the drive home, I felt strangely exhausted. Re-entry is its own kind of emotional labor. I texted Daniel that I was okay, that it had been uneventful, and that I'd tell him more later. He sent back a heart emoji and a joke about needing ice cream for emotional recovery. I smiled at my phone. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same place I had cried silently after the vote. The wood still bore faint marks from years of use, tiny scratches from homework projects, coffee mugs, holiday dinners. I ran my fingers over them and thought about how many moments this table had witnessed: pain and joy, anger and forgiveness, ordinary mornings and extraordinary heartbreaks. I opened my journal and began to write, not for the council, not for the lawyer, but for myself. I wrote about the raised hands, about Daniel's tears, about the silence that followed. I wrote about the letter that shifted everything, about the realization that being kind does not require being quiet. I wrote about the strange peace that comes when you stop trying to control how others see you and start focusing on how you see yourself. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. I volunteered again, but with clearer boundaries. I attended events, but I no longer felt responsible for everyone's comfort. When conversations turned awkward, I let them be awkward. When people tried to gloss over what had happened, I didn't chase closure from them. I found it in my own understanding. Daniel changed too. He became more outspoken in class discussions, more willing to question authority. One night, he told me he had stood up to a professor who dismissed a student's concern. "I kept thinking about you," he said, "about how easy it is for groups to be wrong." I hugged him, proud and a little awed by how pain can turn into courage. The council eventually held a community forum about inclusion and conflict resolution. They invited an outside mediator, passed out pamphlets, and encouraged open dialogue. I attended not because I needed it, but because I wanted to witness growth, however imperfect. When people shared stories of feeling unheard or marginalized, I listened. When they listened to me, truly listened, I felt a quiet sense of purpose. One afternoon, Ruth approached me in the parking lot. Her steps were hesitant, her hands clasped in front of her. "Can we talk?" she asked. We sat on the hood of her car. She admitted that she had felt threatened after my husband's death, that she worried I would change things, that fear had twisted into something ugly. She thought the vote would make things simpler. She didn't think about what it would do to you or Daniel, she said, her voice low. I looked at her for a long moment. Forgiveness is not a switch, it is a process. It did a lot, I said honestly, but it also taught me a lot. I don't know what our relationship will look like now, but I'm willing to be civil and maybe one day more than that. She nodded, tears in her eyes. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. It was something quieter, more realistic. Two people acknowledging harm and uncertainty and choosing not to add more harm. That night, I sat with Daniel on the couch, telling him about the conversation. He listened, his expression thoughtful. "Do you forgive her?" he asked. "I forgive her for myself," I said. "That doesn't mean everything goes back to how it was. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. It just frees you from carrying hate." He leaned back, absorbing that. "I think I get that." Months passed. The memory of the votes softened at the edges, though it never disappeared. It became part of my story, not the whole story. People in the community slowly adjusted, some sincerely, some superficially. I learned to distinguish between the two and to invest my energy accordingly. One evening during a community dinner, I found myself laughing with a group of women as we chopped vegetables. The sound surprised me. It felt unguarded, genuine. I caught my reflection in the kitchen window and saw a woman who had been tested and had not broken. A woman who had learned that belonging is not something others grant you, but something you claim by standing in your truth. Later, as I walked home under the streetlights, I thought about the moral of everything I had lived through. Power can be misused by groups as easily as individuals. Silence can be mistaken for peace. And standing up, even quietly, can change the course of a story. They had all raised their hands to ban me. My son had cried, a letter had arrived, and the world had shifted. But the real transformation had happened inside me. I was no longer waiting for permission to take up space. I was simply taking it, with grace, with firmness, with love for myself and for the son who watched and learned. Time has a way of revealing what moments truly shape us. As winter crept in and the days grew shorter, I realized the vote, the letter, and the reversal were no longer the sharpest parts of my memory. What stayed with me instead were the quieter shifts, the way my spine felt straighter when I walked into rooms, the way I no longer rushed to soften my words for fear of making others uncomfortable. Pain had taught me precision. The holidays were the first real test. Traditionally, our community hosted a large end-of-year gathering, complete with long tables, shared dishes, and speeches that leaned heavily on togetherness. This year, I debated whether to attend, not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood that showing up is a choice, not an obligation. Daniel encouraged me to go. "Not for them," he said, "for you." So I went. I brought a simple dish, nothing elaborate, nothing designed to impress. When I arrived, the room buzzed with activity, and for the first time I noticed how many people looked uncertain when they saw me. They weren't hostile, they just didn't know which version of me they were allowed to interact with, the quiet widow who never pushed back, or the woman who had sent a lawyer's letter and survived. I didn't play either role. I was just myself. I chatted where conversation felt easy and excused myself where it didn't. When someone awkwardly apologized in front of others, I thanked them without offering absolution on the spot. I wasn't there to manage anyone's guilt. I was there to exist. Midway through the evening, the chairperson tapped his glass and made a short speech about resilience and learning from mistakes. He didn't mention my name, but his eyes flicked toward me briefly. I met his gaze and nodded once, not as a sign of submission, but of acknowledgement. We both knew what had happened. We both knew what it had cost. Later that night, as Daniel and I washed dishes at home, he asked me if I felt like things were truly different now. I considered the question carefully. "Some things are," I said. "Some people learned and others are just more careful. The difference is I'm not relying on any of them to define my place anymore." He smiled, thoughtful. "I think that's the part I'll remember," he said. In the months that followed, opportunities opened in unexpected ways. A neighboring community invited me to help organize a support group for widows and single parents. They had heard indirectly about what I'd gone through and admired how I handled it. At first, I hesitated. I didn't see myself as a leader, just a woman who had refused to be erased, but maybe that was enough. The group met twice a month in a small library room. We shared stories, frustrations, small victories. I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, I talked about boundaries, about the difference between peace and silence, about how standing up doesn't always look dramatic. Watching others nod in recognition, I realized my experience had become a bridge for someone else. That gave it meaning beyond my own pain. Daniel noticed the change in me before I did. One evening he said, "You laugh more now." I laughed at that because he was right. Not the nervous laughter I used to use to smooth tension, but real laughter, the kind that comes from feeling grounded. He too was changing. He applied for internships he once thought were out of reach. He challenged ideas that didn't sit right with him. When I asked what gave him the confidence, he shrugged. "I saw what happens when you don't back down, even when it's scary." That was when I understood the deepest impact of everything we'd endured. The vote hadn't just tried to ban me from a community, it had tried to teach my son that power is something you bow to. Instead, he learned that power can be questioned and that dignity is worth defending. Not all consequences were positive. Some relationships never recovered. Invitations remained selective. Certain smiles stayed polite and distant. I let those things be. Closure doesn't always come in the form of reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from acceptance. One afternoon, I found an old photo album while cleaning out a drawer. Pictures of my husband, of Daniel as a child, of community events where everyone looked happy and united. For a moment, grief washed over me anew, not just for my husband, but for the illusion that those moments had guaranteed safety. I sat on the floor and let myself feel it. Growth doesn't erase loss, it teaches you how to carry it. As spring approached, the council sent out a general notice outlining new guidelines for decision-making and conflict resolution, transparency, documentation, mediation before action. Reading it, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Change had come, but only after harm. I wondered how many others had been quietly pushed aside before me, lacking the resources or strength to push back. That thought stayed with me. It became a quiet promise to myself to speak up sooner when I saw injustice, not just when it landed at my feet. One evening, Daniel and I revisited the hall together for a charity event. This time, he walked beside me, relaxed, confident, no tears, no fear. As we sat down, someone asked him how he was doing, referencing the incident in a careful, roundabout way. He smiled and said, "We're good. We learned a lot." I reached over and squeezed his hand under the table. As the event unfolded, I looked around the room and saw it clearly. This place no longer held power over me. It was just a building full of people doing their best and sometimes failing. My worth was not up for a vote. It never had been. On the drive home, Daniel asked me if I ever regretted sending that letter. I didn't hesitate. "No," I said, because even if the outcome had been different, I would still have known I stood up for us. He nodded, staring out the window. "I hope I remember that," he said quietly. "You will," I told him. "It becomes part of you." That night, lying in bed, I reflected on the arc of it all. The shock of the raised hands, the sound of my son crying, the calm weight of legal paper changing the direction of things. But more than that, I thought about the woman I had been before, eager to keep peace at any cost, and the woman I was now. The moral was simple, but not easy. Belonging should never require your silence. Love should never demand your erasure. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is respond to cruelty not with shouting, but with clarity, resolve, and the refusal to disappear. By the time summer arrived, the air felt lighter, not because everything had been healed, but because I had stopped bracing for impact. There is a difference between peace and preparedness, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't living in constant readiness for the next disappointment. I woke up with plans that had nothing to do with proving myself. That alone felt like a quiet miracle. Daniel came home one afternoon with an acceptance letter for an internship he'd almost talked himself out of applying for. He stood in the doorway holding the envelope like it might disappear if he let go. When I read it, I felt tears sting my eyes. The good kind, the kind that come from seeing your child step into his own future. We celebrated with takeout and laughter, sprawled on the living room floor like we used to when he was younger. That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone and thought about how close we'd come to a very different outcome. If I had accepted the ban quietly, if I had swallowed the humiliation for the sake of peace, what lesson would he have learned then? That survival means shrinking, that love is conditional, that power belongs only to those who wield it loudly. The thought made my chest tighten. I was grateful I hadn't chosen that path. The support group continued to grow. Word spread, as it does, not through announcements, but through quiet recommendations. Someone would bring a friend, a sister, a neighbor. Stories poured out, different in detail, but similar in shape. Exclusion, grief, being told subtly or directly that their presence was inconvenient. I listened, sometimes with my hands folded, sometimes gripping a tissue, always with the awareness that I was no longer alone in what I'd experienced. One evening, a woman about my age looked at me and said, "How did you find the courage to push back?" I thought about it before answering. "I didn't feel brave," I said. "I felt cornered." Courage came later after I realized staying silent would cost me more than speaking up. She nodded like that was the permission she'd been waiting for. Back in my own community, things had settled into a cautious normal. The council members were polite, almost deferential. They followed procedures meticulously now. It would have been easy to take that as a personal victory, but I resisted that temptation. Systems change when they're forced to, not when they suddenly become kind. I stayed observant, engaged, but no longer invested in approval. One afternoon, the chairperson asked if I would consider joining a small advisory committee on inclusion. I was surprised by the request, not because I doubted my ability, but because I understood what it symbolized. They wanted my presence to signal growth. I told him I would think about it. At home, Daniel raised an eyebrow when I mentioned it. Do you want to? He asked. I want to make sure it's for the right reasons, I said, not because they feel guilty, not because it looks good. In the end, I agreed, with clear boundaries. I would participate as long as the work was genuine and shared, not performative. The first meeting was awkward, full of careful language and long pauses, but slowly real conversations emerged about fear, about tradition, about the harm that happens when unity is valued more than justice. I listened, sometimes with my hands folded, sometimes gripping a tissue, always with the awareness that I was no longer alone in what I'd experienced. One evening, a woman about my age looked at me and said, "How did you find the courage to push back?" I thought about it before answering. I didn't feel brave, I said. I felt cornered. Courage came later after I realized staying silent would cost me more than speaking up. She nodded like that was the permission she'd been waiting for. Back in my own community, things had settled into a cautious normal. The council members were polite, almost deferential. They followed procedures meticulously now. It would have been easy to take that as a personal victory, but I resisted that temptation. Systems change when they're forced to, not when they suddenly become kind. I stayed observant, engaged, but no longer invested in approval. One afternoon, the chairperson asked if I would consider joining a small advisory committee on inclusion. I was surprised by the request, not because I doubted my ability, but because I understood what it symbolized. They wanted my presence to signal growth. I told him I would think about it. At home, Daniel raised an eyebrow when I mentioned it. Do you want to? He asked. I want to make sure it's for the right reasons, I said, not because they feel guilty, not because it looks good. In the end, I agreed, with clear boundaries. I would participate as long as the work was genuine and shared, not performative. The first meeting was awkward, full of careful language and long pauses, but slowly real conversations emerged about fear, about tradition, about the harm that happens when unity is valued more than justice. I listened, sometimes with my hands folded, sometimes gripping a tissue, always with the awareness that I was no longer alone in what I'd experienced. One evening, a woman about my age looked at me and said, "How did you find the courage to push back?" I thought about it before answering. I didn't feel brave, I said. I felt cornered. Courage came later after I realized staying silent would cost me more than speaking up. She nodded like that was the permission she'd been waiting for. Back in my own community, things had settled into a cautious normal. The council members were polite, almost deferential. They followed procedures meticulously now. It would have been easy to take that as a personal victory, but I resisted that temptation. Systems change when they're forced to, not when they suddenly become kind. I stayed observant, engaged, but no longer invested in approval. One afternoon, the chairperson asked if I would consider joining a small advisory committee on inclusion. I was surprised by the request, not because I doubted my ability, but because I understood what it symbolized. They wanted my presence to signal growth. I told him I would think about it. At home, Daniel raised an eyebrow when I mentioned it. Do you want to? He asked. I want to make sure it's for the right reasons, I said, not because they feel guilty, not because it looks good. In the end, I agreed, with clear boundaries. I would participate as long as the work was genuine and shared, not performative. The first meeting was awkward, full of careful language and long pauses, but slowly real conversations emerged about fear, about tradition, about the harm that happens when unity is valued more than justice. I listened, sometimes with my hands folded, sometimes gripping a tissue, always with the awareness that I was no longer alone in what I'd experienced. One evening, a woman about my age looked at me and said, "How did you find the courage to push back?" I thought about it before answering. I didn't feel brave, I said. I felt cornered. Courage came later after I realized staying silent would cost me more than speaking up. She nodded like that was the permission she'd been waiting for. Back in my own community, things had settled into a cautious normal. The council members were polite, almost deferential. They followed procedures meticulously now. It would have been easy to take that as a personal victory, but I resisted that temptation. Systems change when they're forced to, not when they suddenly become kind. I stayed observant, engaged, but no longer invested in approval. One afternoon, the chairperson asked if I would consider joining a small advisory committee on inclusion. I was surprised by the request, not because I doubted my ability, but because I understood what it symbolized. They wanted my presence to signal growth. I told him I would think about it. At home, Daniel raised an eyebrow when I mentioned it. "Do you want to?" he asked. "I want to make sure it's for the right reasons," I said, "not because they feel guilty, not because it looks good." In the end, I agreed, with clear boundaries. I would participate as long as the work was genuine and shared, not performative. The first meeting was awkward, full of careful language and long pauses, but slowly real conversations emerged about fear, about tradition, about the harm that happens when unity is valued more than justice. I listened, sometimes with my hands folded, sometimes gripping a tissue, always with the awareness that I was no longer alone in what I'd experienced. One evening, a woman about my age looked at me and said, "How did you find the courage to push back?" I thought about it before answering. "I didn't feel brave," I said. "I felt cornered." Courage came later, after I realized staying silent would cost me more than speaking up. She nodded, like that was the permission she'd been waiting for. Back in my own community, things had settled into a cautious normal. The council members were polite, almost deferential. They followed procedures meticulously now. It would have been easy to take that as a personal victory, but I resisted that temptation. Systems change when they're forced to, not when they suddenly become kind. I stayed observant, engaged, but no longer invested in approval. One afternoon, the chairperson asked if I would consider joining a small advisory committee on inclusion. I was surprised by the request, not because I doubted my ability, but because I understood what it symbolized. They wanted my presence to signal growth. I told him I would think about it. At home, Daniel raised an eyebrow when I mentioned it. "Do you want to?" he asked. "I want to make sure it's for the right reasons," I said, "not because they feel guilty, not because it looks good." In the end, I agreed, with clear boundaries. I would participate as Daniel's absence changed the rhythm of my days more than I expected. I had prepared for the quiet, but not for the way it would amplify my thoughts. Without his presence grounding me, memories surfaced more freely, drifting in during idle moments like uninvited guests. I didn't fight them anymore. I let them come, sit, and leave when they were ready. Healing, I had learned, isn't about eviction. It's about coexistence. One afternoon, I received an email from a woman in a neighboring town. She had heard about the support group through a cousin and asked if I would be willing to speak at a small gathering about navigating conflict within close-knit communities. My first instinct was to decline. Public speaking had never been my strength, and the idea of revisiting that pain in front of strangers felt heavy. But something in her message struck me. She wrote that several people in her group felt invisible, and they needed to hear that survival didn't always mean leaving. I agreed. The room was modest, a circle of folding chairs in a community center much like my own. As I stood there, looking at faces etched with worry, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Then I remembered the hall, the raised hands, and how I had stood anyway. I told my stories simply. I talked about the vote, the letter, the fear, and the choice to respond with clarity instead of collapse. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't soften it either. When I finished, there was silence, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that follows recognition. Then questions came. How did you know when to fight? How did you protect your child? How do you stay when staying hurts? I answered as honestly as I could, admitting where I had doubted myself, where I still did. Afterward, a man approached me with tears in his eyes. "I thought I was weak for wanting to leave," he said. "Now I think I might just need to stand differently." Driving home, I felt a quiet sense of purpose settle in. I hadn't chosen this role, but it had found me anyway. Pain has a way of carving paths you didn't plan to walk. Back home, the advisory committee continued its work. Progress was slow, sometimes frustratingly so. Old habits die hard, especially in institutions built on tradition. There were moments when I questioned why I had agreed to be part of it. Then there were moments when someone would pause, reconsider, and choose a better approach. Those moments mattered. Change rarely arrives as a wave. More often, it seeps in, reshaping the ground beneath you. One evening, Ruth attended a meeting and spoke openly about fear and control. She didn't name me, but the room understood. Listening to her, I felt a mix of compassion and distance. Her honesty didn't erase the harm, but it marked a step forward. I realized then that forgiveness doesn't always mean closeness. Sometimes it means allowing growth without demanding intimacy. Daniel called every few days, his voice animated with stories from his internship. He talked about deadlines, mentors, and the thrill of being taken seriously. Once he admitted he had challenged a policy he felt was unfair. He didn't win, he said, laughing softly, but I didn't feel small for trying. I smiled into the phone, my heart full. "That's how it starts," I told him. As autumn approached again, nearly a year since the vote, the community prepared for elections. New council members were nominated, including a few younger faces. Watching the process unfold, I felt a strange sense of detachment. I no longer saw leadership as something distant or untouchable. It was just people, flawed and capable of learning. One afternoon, I was asked if I would consider running for a position. The suggestion startled me. I laughed it off at first, but the idea lingered. I thought about the woman I had been before the vote, reluctant to draw attention, eager to keep peace. Then I thought about who I was now. I didn't run, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. My influence no longer depended on a title. It lived in conversations, in presence, in the example I set simply by existing without apology. On the anniversary of the vote, I took the day off work and drove to a nearby lake. I sat on a bench and watched the water ripple under a gray sky. I let myself remember every detail: the room, the hands, Daniel's tears, and then I let myself remember everything that had followed: the letter, the reversal, the growth. I whispered a quiet thank you to the woman I had been in that moment of decision, the one who chose not to disappear. That evening, Daniel came home for a visit. We cooked dinner together, falling into old rhythms. Over dessert, he asked me if I still felt angry. I said I feel informed after a moment. Anger was the messenger. I listened. I don't need it to stay. He nodded, thoughtful. "I think that's what scares people," he said, "when someone doesn't need their approval anymore." "Maybe," I replied, "but it also sets them free to be better if they choose." As the night wound down, I realized how complete the arc felt. Not perfect, not without scars, but whole. What began as a public attempt to erase me had become a private affirmation of my worth. They had raised their hands to ban me, my son had cried, a letter had arrived, and in the space that followed, I had learned the quiet, unshakable truth that would guide me for the rest of my life. Belonging is not granted by consensus. It is claimed by standing firm in who you are, even when the room tells you to sit down. There is a strange clarity that comes after a storm is fully passed. Not the kind that leaves everything untouched, but the kind that rearranges the landscape so thoroughly you have no choice but to learn it again. That was where I found myself as another year unfolded, moving through days with a steadiness that once felt impossible. I no longer measured my steps by who might be watching. I simply walked. Daniel settled back into life at home after his internship ended, taller somehow, not in inches, but in presence. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that made me pause more than once just to observe him. We talked often about his future, about choices and compromises, about how to tell the difference between opportunity and obligation. I noticed he no longer asked me what he should do, he asked what I thought. It was a small but meaningful shift. One evening, while sorting through mail, I found an envelope from the council. For a brief moment, my stomach tightened, an old reflex. Then I smiled at myself for noticing it without letting it take over. Inside was an invitation to a community reflection night, marking the changes implemented over the past year. They wanted people to share experiences, lessons learned, and hopes moving forward. I set the letter down and made tea, letting it steep while I considered whether I would attend. Part of me felt finished with that chapter. Another part understood that stories gain power when they are shared at the right time, not from wounds still bleeding, but from scars that have healed enough to teach. I decided to go. The hall looked different that night, rearranged into a wide circle instead of rigid rows. Candles flickered on the tables, softening the space. The atmosphere was tentative but sincere. People spoke about misunderstandings, about fear of change, about moments they wished they had handled differently. I listened without interrupting, recognizing echoes of my own journey in their words. When it was my turn, I stood slowly. I didn't recount every detail. I didn't need to. I talked about the danger of confusing harmony with silence, about how quickly communities can turn on those who disrupt familiar narratives, especially when grief or difference makes others uncomfortable. I spoke about my son, about the cost of teaching children that belonging is conditional. The room was quiet when I finished, not heavy, thoughtful. The chairperson thanked me, his voice sincere in a way it hadn't been before. For the first time, I felt no distance between us, just two people who had learned something hard. After the meeting, a teenager approached me, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I'm glad you said that," he muttered. "Sometimes it feels like if you don't fit, you should just leave." I looked at him and saw Daniel at that age, earnest and unsure. "Sometimes leaving is right," I said gently, "but sometimes staying and speaking changes things. The important part is knowing you have a choice." He nodded, relief visible in his shoulders. Walking home that night, I realized how much my understanding of power had shifted. It no longer looked like authority or numbers or raised hands. It looked like influence earned through integrity, like the ability to stand in a room without shrinking or hardening. At home, Daniel listened as I told him about the evening. He smiled softly. "You know, I used to think strength was about winning." "And now?" I asked. "Now I think it's about not losing yourself," he replied. That stayed with me. Life continued as it does, with ordinary challenges and quiet joys. I took a short trip on my own, something I hadn't done since my husband passed. Standing in a new place, anonymous and free, I felt a deep gratitude for the path that had brought me there, even the painful turns, especially those. One afternoon, I received a message from a woman who had been part of the support group early on. She told me she had finally spoken up at a meeting where she'd been routinely dismissed. She wrote, "They didn't like it, but I didn't feel invisible." I closed my eyes and breathed that in. Change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, one person at a time, carried forward by stories that refuse to stay buried. As another anniversary of the vote approached, I noticed something unexpected. I no longer felt the need to mark it. The date passed without ceremony, without dread. The memory was still there, but it had lost its sharpness. It had become a reference point rather than a wound. Daniel and I talked about it one evening, almost casually. He admitted he rarely thought about that day now. He said, "It taught me what I needed to know. I don't need to relive it." I smiled, recognizing the truth in that. Lessons once learned don't require constant review. Looking back, I see the story clearly. A group tried to protect itself by excluding what made it uncomfortable. A child witnessed that exclusion and felt its cruelty. A letter arrived, not as a weapon, but as a boundary, and in the space that followed, people were forced to confront the consequences of their choices. But the real ending wasn't written by the counsel or the lawyer. It was written in the way I now move through the world, with my head up, with my voice intact, with a son who knows his worth is non-negotiable. If there's a moral to be found here, it is this. When people raise their hands to ban you, they reveal more about themselves than about you. And when you choose not to disappear, when you answer exclusion with resolution and clarity, you don't just reclaim your place, you redefine it. By the time another winter settled in, I realized how little I feared it. Winter used to feel like something to endure, a season that magnified loneliness and loss. This time, it arrived quietly, almost gently, and I met it without resistance. I had learned that not every cold stretch signals danger. Some simply invite reflection. Daniel was finishing his final year, balancing classes and part-time work with a confidence that still surprised me. One evening, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, paper spread out, and said he'd been offered a position after graduation. He tried to sound casual, but his hands betrayed him, tapping lightly against his notebook. I congratulated him, my heart swelling, and asked how he felt about it. He paused. "I want it," he said, "but I want to make sure I'm choosing it, not just accepting it." I smiled at that. "That's wisdom," I told him. "Not everything offered deserves a yes." We talked long into the night about paths and priorities. I noticed how often he referenced values instead of expectations. That, more than any success, felt like proof that something lasting had come from what we'd lived through. In the community, things continued to evolve. New leadership brought subtle changes in tone and approach. Meetings felt less rigid, more open. People asked questions they once avoided. I attended when I felt inclined and stayed home when I didn't. Freedom, I had learned, includes the right to disengage. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a former council member who had moved away. She wrote to apologize, acknowledging that she had raised her hand out of fear rather than conviction. "I didn't know how to stand alone," she admitted. Reading her words, I felt a gentle sadness. Fear isolates in ways people rarely recognize until it's too late. I didn't respond immediately. Some apologies are for the sender as much as the receiver. Eventually, I wrote back a short note thanking her for the honesty and wishing her well. I didn't reopen the past. I didn't need to. The support group transitioned into something less formal, more self-sustaining. Members took turns facilitating, sharing responsibility. Watching that happen, I felt a quiet pride. Leadership, I realized, is successful when it becomes unnecessary. One snowy evening, Daniel and I revisited the hall together for a winter concert. Sitting beside him, listening to familiar songs, I felt no trace of the tension that once gripped me in that space. The room held no power now, only memory. When the lights dimmed and the music swelled, I closed my eyes and let myself simply be present. Afterward, as we walked to the car, Daniel said something that stayed with me. "I don't think I'd be who I am without that day," he said. "Neither would I replied. Spring came early that year. Crocuses pushed through the thawing ground, stubborn and bright. I took long walks, noticing how often resilience shows up in quiet ways. Life didn't feel extraordinary, it felt grounded, and that, I had come to understand, was a gift. One afternoon, I ran into Mrs. Calder again, this time at a cafe. We shared a table and talked about ordinary things. Before leaving, she said, "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I answered honestly. Staying hadn't meant accepting harm, it had meant transforming it, turning exclusion into a boundary, turning silence into voice, turning a moment of public rejection into a private declaration of worth. As Daniel prepared to move on to the next chapter of his life, I felt ready too, not because everything was resolved, but because I trusted myself to handle what came next. That trust had been hard-won, forged in the space between raised hands and a letter written in resolve. Looking back, the story feels complete, not because it ended neatly, but because it taught what it needed to teach. When people try to ban you, they may believe they're protecting themselves. What they're really doing is revealing a fear of what they can't control. And when you answer that fear, not with disappearance, but with clarity and dignity, you don't just change the outcome, you change the meaning of the moment itself. My son cried that day. I held him and promised we would be okay. I didn't know how then. I know now. We were okay because we chose not to surrender who we were, because we understood that justice sometimes arrives quietly, folded into an envelope, carried by the courage to say, "This is not acceptable." That is the truth I carry forward, and it is enough. There is a quiet kind of ending that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with applause or dramatic farewells. It arrives on an ordinary morning when you wake up and realize you are no longer carrying something you once thought would weigh you down forever. That was how the final chapter of this story revealed itself to me. Not as a moment, but as a realization. Daniel moved out in early summer, not far, just far enough to feel like a step into his own life. The morning he packed his last box, the house echoed in a way it never had before. I walked through each room slowly after he left, touching the door frames, the backs of chairs, the places where our lives had overlapped so completely. I expected sadness to overwhelm me. Instead, I felt something steadier, gratitude. We had walked through something hard together and come out intact. More than that, we had come out honest. A week later, he called me late at night. Nothing was wrong. He just wanted to talk. We spoke about work, about a disagreement he'd had with a colleague, about how strange it felt to be fully responsible for his own decisions. At one point, he laughed softly and said, "I keep hearing your voice in my head when things get uncomfortable." I smiled in the dark. "Good," I said. "Discomfort is usually where truth lives." After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet house, thinking about how close we had come to a different legacy. If I had accepted the ban without resistance, if I had modeled compliance instead of courage, what would he have carried with him instead? That question no longer frightened me. It affirmed me. In the months that followed, my life didn't become extraordinary. It became intentional. I chose where to invest my time. I said no more often and yes more deliberately. I stayed involved in the community, but I no longer defined myself by it. I was part of it, not dependent on it. Occasionally, new people would ask me about what had happened. The story had become one of those things everyone vaguely knew but rarely discussed openly. When asked, I told it plainly. No embellishment, no bitterness, just the facts and what they taught me. I noticed that people listened differently when the story was told without anger. It invited reflection instead of defensiveness. One afternoon, I found myself back in the hall alone, helping set up for a small event. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. I paused in the middle of the room and looked around. I remembered the way my heart had pounded the day of the vote, the sound of hands rising, the way Daniel's sobs had cut through everything. Standing there now, calm and steady, I felt the full arc of it, not as pain, but as proof. Proof that moments meant to diminish you can become the very foundation of your strength. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. Later that evening, I sat on my porch as the sky darkened, thinking about the moral people always look for in stories like this. They want clear villains and heroes, swift justice, neat conclusions. Life rarely offers that. What it offers instead are choices, moments where you decide who you will be when tested. They all raised their hands to ban me. My son cried. That is true. But what is also true is what came next. I chose not to disappear. I chose to respond with clarity instead of chaos, with resolution instead of rage. I chose to show my child that dignity does not require permission. The letter from my lawyer mattered. It shifted power. It forced accountability. But it was not the heart of the story. The heart was the moment before that letter was written, when I decided my worth was not up for debate. If you take anything from this, let it be this. When people try to erase you, it is not always because you are weak. Often it is because your presence reminds them of something they have avoided facing. Do not rush to make yourself smaller to soothe that discomfort. Stand where you are. Speak when it matters. Protect what is sacred to you, especially the eyes watching and learning from how you respond. I did not win because the ban was overturned. I won because I kept my voice, because my son learned that justice is something you participate in, not something you wait for, because a room full of raised hands did not get to define the rest of our lives. This story ends not with a vote or a letter, but with a woman at peace, a son standing tall, and a truth that cannot be taken away. Belonging is not something others grant you. It is something you claim the moment you refuse to disappear.